Is evil truly something terrifying and complex? Or can it be something entirely ordinary and mundane? Could people who are merely following orders become the most dangerous figures in history? Many philosophers have tried to explore concepts like freedom, justice, and power, but few have challenged the modern world as profoundly as Hannah Arendt. She was not only one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, but also a philosopher who forced the world to rethink evil, politics, and freedom. In this video, we will delve into the life and ideas of a woman whose philosophy was shaped by her first-hand experience of escaping Nazism, who witnessed a trial that transformed global discourse, and who wrote books that are still studied in universities today. How can an ordinary person become a blind executor of atrocities? Why is true freedom under threat in the modern world? Where does real power come from? And why is the use of force always a sign of weakness? All these questions and more will be explored in this special episode from FactUp. Stay with us as we uncover the legacy of Hannah Arendt, the woman who changed the way we think about politics, freedom, and the nature of evil. Are you ready to step into the world of Arendt's thought? Let's begin. A Jewish woman who fled Nazi Germany, yet never allowed victimhood to define her identity. She didn't discover philosophy in a university lecture hall, but in the midst of war and crisis. But how did this journey turn her into one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century? Hannah Arendt was born in 1906 in Hanover, Germany, but she spent most of her childhood in Königsberg, the birthplace of Immanuel Kant. From an early age, she displayed a sharp and independent mind, showing a deep passion for reading and critical thinking. Her mother, an educated and progressive woman, played a crucial role in nurturing her intellectual curiosity. In 1924, Arendt enrolled at the University of Marburg, where she studied under Martin Heidegger, a leading figure in existentialism and phenomenology. It was during this time that she formed a close intellectual and personal relationship with Heidegger, a connection that would later become one of the most controversial relationships in 20th century philosophy. How did Heidegger influence her philosophical thinking? How did she react when her former mentor aligned himself with the Nazi regime? Due to the increasing restrictions placed on Jews in Germany, Arendt left Marburg and briefly studied at the University of Freiburg before moving to the University of Heidelberg. There, she completed her doctorate under Karl Jaspers, a renowned existentialist philosopher who later became one of her closest friends and intellectual allies. Her dissertation, Love and St. Augustine, focused not on political philosophy but on religious thought. Why did she choose a religious theme for her dissertation instead of political philosophy? How did her academic relationship with Jaspers shape her intellectual path? Fleeing Germany and entering the political arena. With the rise of the Nazi regime in 1933, life became increasingly dangerous for Jewish intellectuals. Arendt, who was involved in anti-Nazi activities, was arrested by the Gestapo but miraculously released. Realizing she could no longer stay in Germany, she fled to France. In Paris, she joined various Jewish refugee organizations and worked tirelessly to support those escaping Nazi persecution. However, when the Nazis invaded France in 1940, Arendt faced yet another crisis. She was interned in a concentration camp for stateless refugees, but managed to escape. In 1941, with the help of an underground network of intellectuals and activists, she fled to the United States, where she would spend the rest of her life. How did a Jewish refugee in exile become one of the most influential political thinkers of the 20th century? Why did her arrival in America mark a turning point in her philosophical journey? The birth of a political philosopher. After settling in New York, Arendt established herself as a political analyst and writer. She contributed to major publications, taught at prestigious universities, and gradually became one of the most significant political philosophers of her time. But what truly cemented her legacy were the books that challenged the very foundations of modern political thought. How did her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, change the world's understanding of dictatorship and oppression? Why did her theory of the banality of evil in the Eichmann trial spark global controversy? Hannah Arendt's journey, from a young student in Marburg, listening to a controversial philosopher, to one of the most important political thinkers of modern times, was shaped not just by academic influences, but by the harrowing realities she lived through. She did not merely analyze history, she experienced it firsthand, and that experience made her work all the more powerful. In the next section, we will explore her groundbreaking political theories and how she redefined concepts like power, freedom, and totalitarianism. Stay with us. Is power the same as force? Is freedom just an idea, or can it become something real and tangible? Is evil inherently monstrous, or can it emerge from the most ordinary people? Hannah Arendt, unlike many political philosophers, did not shape her philosophy in academic libraries, but through war, exile, and witnessing the horrors of the 20th century. These experiences made her one of the most insightful analysts of politics, power, and freedom. But how did she understand these concepts? Let's explore her ideas by asking the critical questions she tackled and the answers she provided. What is the difference between power and force? At first glance, power and force seem identical, but are they really the same? For Arendt, power and force, or violence, are entirely different concepts. She argues, force is the use of violence to impose one's will on others. Power is derived from the collective agreement and unity of people, not from violence. A concrete example, Arendt compared power to grassroots movements. Consider the civil rights movement in the United States, led by Martin Luther King Jr. This movement achieved major legal and social changes without using violence. According to Arendt, this is real power. But when a government resorts to oppression and violence to maintain control, it is not displaying strength, it is revealing its weakness. She famously wrote, "Where violence rules absolutely, power has disappeared." This means that when a dictator relies on force, he is actually demonstrating the collapse of his legitimacy, not his strength. Why can evil be banal? When we think of history's most horrific crimes, we often assume that their perpetrators were evil, sadistic individuals. But is that always the case? While attending the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the key figures responsible for the Holocaust, Arendt was struck by an unsettling realization. He was not a monster, but an ordinary bureaucratic man. Who was Eichmann? He did not express deep hatred for Jews, nor did he seem to enjoy the mass killings. Instead, he simply repeated that he was following orders and doing his job. This led Arendt to a shocking conclusion. Evil can arise from completely ordinary people who stop thinking critically. Those who blindly obey oppressive systems can become the perpetrators of history's greatest crimes. Why was this idea so controversial? Many people expected Eichmann to be an obvious monster, but Arendt argued that evil often stems from mindlessness and unquestioning obedience rather than deliberate malice. This concept, which she called the banality of evil, remains one of the most thought-provoking ideas in modern political philosophy. What is real freedom, and how can it be achieved? Is freedom just the absence of oppression, or does it require something more? Arendt believed that freedom was not just about being free from oppression, but about the ability to act and participate in public life. In ancient Greece, she noted, freedom meant active participation in politics and shaping the community's future. In the modern world, however, many people believe freedom is simply being left alone to do as they please. According to Arendt, this is a modern form of enslavement. A concrete example, imagine living in a society where the government does not restrict your personal choices, but you have no say in political decisions. Are you truly free? Arendt argued, freedom is not just the absence of restraint, it is the capacity to bring about change in the world. Does history repeat itself? Do oppressive regimes still use the same tactics that Arendt described? Have modern media and technology made people more aware, or have they made them more passive? After exploring Arendt's views on power, evil, freedom, and democracy, we now ask, how do her ideas remain relevant in today's world? How can we see Arendt's ideas reflected in modern politics and media? Has the digital age truly made people more informed, or has it only created the illusion of awareness? Does the threat of totalitarianism still exist today? To answer these questions, we must take a closer look at the modern world and its striking similarities to Arendt's analysis of the 20th century. Do modern governments use totalitarian tactics? In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt explained how oppressive regimes maintain their power. lies and propaganda. Totalitarian governments do not just silence opposition, they manipulate truth through media so that people struggle to distinguish reality from fiction. Spreading fear and distrust. When people fear one another and cannot trust anyone, collective resistance becomes impossible. Eliminating critical thinking. If individuals stop questioning and blindly accept whatever they are told, governments can impose any narrative on them. A modern example. Today, many governments use the internet and social media to control information and manipulate public perception. Fake news, propaganda, and media manipulation are modern tools that serve the same function as totalitarian tactics of the past. Have modern media made people more aware or more passive? One of the most pressing questions today is whether the internet and social media have truly made us more informed or simply turned us into passive spectators. Arendt believed that real freedom comes from political action and participation in public life, not just from having access to information. Information without critical thinking is meaningless. Knowing vast amounts of data without analyzing it does not lead to true awareness. Becoming passive spectators. Many people believe they are engaged simply because they read news on social media, but in reality, their engagement is often superficial. The attack on reality. When people are convinced that truth is subjective and facts can be manipulated, they stop trusting any source of information. A modern example. Many social movements start on social media, but fail to create real-world change. Sharing a post or using a hashtag instead of taking real action is what Arendt would call the illusion of participation. Is digital totalitarianism possible? Could government surveillance and data control lead to a modern form of totalitarianism? Digital surveillance. Today, many governments collect vast amounts of personal data through the internet, smartphones, and social media. This level of surveillance is one of the key features of totalitarian regimes that Arendt warned about. The erosion of privacy. The more personal data is controlled by governments and corporations, the less freedom individuals truly have. The creation of a virtual reality. In the modern era, truth is shaped by algorithms and targeted advertisements. People only receive information that aligns with their existing beliefs, creating information bubbles and reducing critical thinking. A modern example. In countries where the internet is heavily controlled, the truth can be distorted, and citizens only see what their governments allow. But even in democratic societies, digital surveillance and targeted propaganda make it easier to manipulate public opinion. Are we still vulnerable to the banality of evil? Does our world still suffer from the same banality of evil that Arendt warned about? Indifferent individuals can become instruments of oppression. In today's world, many people obey unjust laws or policies without questioning their morality. Evil can emerge from blind obedience. Employees who mindlessly follow unethical corporate policies or security forces who suppress peaceful protests are examples of this banality of evil. Technology can normalize immorality. Artificial intelligence, surveillance systems, and bureaucratic procedures can make unethical decisions feel like neutral, automated processes with no personal accountability. A modern example. In many large corporations, employees make routine decisions that contribute to injustice, poverty, or even human suffering. However, because they are simply following company policy, they feel no personal responsibility. How can Arendt's ideas help us address modern challenges? Keep critical thinking alive. The best way to fight the banality of evil is to never stop questioning and analyzing. Decentralize power. Whenever major decisions are controlled by a small group, the risk of abuse and authoritarianism increases. Avoid the illusion of freedom. Having access to information without the ability to enact change is not true freedom. Democracy requires real participation. If we leave politics only to politicians and ignore our role as citizens, we will inevitably lose our freedoms. Why do Arendt's ideas still matter? Today, in an era of mass surveillance, information wars, and the illusion of awareness, Arendt's warnings are more relevant than ever. She reminds us that if we remain silent in the face of injustice, allow power to slip away from the people, and abandon critical thinking, we will ultimately be responsible for the decline of freedom. In the next section, we will examine the criticisms and challenges to Arendt's ideas. Stay with us. Part 5. Criticisms and challenges to Hannah Arendt's ideas. Was Arendt too idealistic about power? Did she misinterpret the nature of evil? Is her vision of democracy too demanding for the modern world? While her ideas have shaped political philosophy, they have also faced significant criticism. So far, we have explored Arendt's views on power, freedom, evil, and democracy, and how they relate to the modern world. However, no philosopher is beyond critique. Arendt's work has been challenged from multiple angles. Some accuse her of oversimplifying political power, while others believe she misunderstood the true nature of totalitarianism and evil. In this section, we will critically examine some of the most important debates surrounding Arendt's work. Did Arendt misunderstand totalitarianism? Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism is one of the most influential analyses of oppressive regimes. She argued that Nazism and Stalinism were the only true totalitarian systems in history, because they sought complete control over society, not just through oppression but by attempting to reshape reality itself. However, some scholars criticize her definition of totalitarianism for being too rigid and limited. Some argue that authoritarian regimes today do not fit Arendt's strict definition, yet they still function as oppressive, controlling forces. Others believe she ignored the economic dimensions of totalitarianism, focusing too much on ideology and propaganda. Critics have also suggested that her emphasis on terror as the key feature of totalitarian rule does not account for modern regimes that control people through digital surveillance and economic pressure rather than outright fear. Example: some modern authoritarian governments use advanced surveillance, artificial intelligence, and economic dependence to maintain power without needing the extreme terror methods of Stalinism or Nazism. Does this mean Arendt's definition of totalitarianism needs to be updated? Was her concept of the banality of evil too simplistic? One of the most controversial ideas in Arendt's work is the banality of evil, which she introduced in Eichmann in Jerusalem. She suggested that Adolf Eichmann, a key organizer of the Holocaust, was not a sadistic monster, but rather a bureaucrat who blindly followed orders without thinking critically about his actions. However, many critics argue that Eichmann was more than just a passive bureaucrat. He actively supported Nazi policies and took pride in his work. Arendt's portrayal of Eichmann downplayed the ideological commitment of many Nazi officials who were deeply involved in the genocide. Some scholars believe she underestimated the role of hatred, fanaticism, and personal ambition in driving mass atrocities. Example: historians have since uncovered documents suggesting that Eichmann was not simply thoughtless, but had strong anti-Semitic beliefs and actively shaped Nazi deportation policies. Did Arendt oversimplify the psychology of evil? Is Arendt's idea of political participation too demanding? Arendt believed that true freedom requires active participation in public life. She admired the democratic engagement of ancient Athens, where citizens actively shaped political decisions. But is this expectation realistic in the modern world? Most people today do not have the time or interest to engage deeply in politics. Arendt's model of democracy assumes that everyone wants to be politically active, but many prefer to focus on personal lives rather than public affairs. Some critics argue that expecting constant political engagement ignores the complexity of modern economies and governance structures, where specialized knowledge is required for decision-making. Example: in many democracies, voter turnout is declining and people are disengaging from politics. Is this proof that Arendt's vision of democracy is impractical for the modern world? Did she ignore the role of social and economic inequalities? Arendt's focus was primarily on political philosophy, power, and totalitarianism, but some critics argue that she neglected social and economic structures that shape political life. She focused on political action, but did not analyze how economic inequality limits people's ability to participate in politics. Her admiration for ancient Greek democracy overlooked the fact that it was built on slavery and social hierarchy. Some argue that her analysis of totalitarianism ignored the economic conditions that allowed such regimes to emerge in the first place. Example: in the modern world, economic power plays a huge role in shaping politics. Billionaires and corporations often have more influence than ordinary citizens. Should Arendt have addressed these inequalities more directly? Why do these debates matter? Even though Arendt's ideas have been criticized, they continue to inspire deep discussions about power, freedom, and political responsibility. The fact that scholars still debate her work shows how influential her philosophy remains. Her analysis of totalitarianism, even if imperfect, helped define how we understand oppressive regimes today. Her warning about the banality of evil forces us to question how ordinary people can become complicit in great crimes. Her emphasis on political participation, even if idealistic, reminds us that democracy requires active engagement. Final thought: whether we agree or disagree with Arendt, her work challenges us to think more critically about power, responsibility, and freedom. The questions she raised remain urgent and relevant in our time. In the next section, we will conclude our exploration of Hannah Arendt by reflecting on her legacy and what we can learn from her today. Stay with us. Why do Hannah Arendt's ideas still matter? Was she just a philosopher of the 20th century, or can her thoughts guide us in facing today's challenges? Hannah Arendt was not only one of the most influential political philosophers of the 20th century, but her ideas continue to shape politics, philosophy, human rights, and even popular culture. In this section, we explore how her intellectual legacy remains alive and what lessons we can learn from her in our contemporary world. How has Arendt influenced politics and political thought today? Her concept of the banality of evil is still used to analyze war crimes and inhumane policies. Her critique of totalitarianism remains relevant in studying modern authoritarian regimes and new methods of oppression. Her emphasis on active political participation and civic responsibility has inspired democratic movements worldwide. Example: in international war crime tribunals, Arendt's theory of the banality of evil has been cited to explain how ordinary people can become complicit in horrific crimes. Why is her vision of freedom and democracy still important? Arendt defined freedom as the ability to engage in political action, rather than just personal or economic freedom. She warned that democracy would decay without the active participation of its citizens. She foresaw the danger of a society that consumes information without critical thinking. Example: in the era of social media and mass information, Arendt's warnings about the dangers of a spectator society are more relevant than ever. Today, many people passively consume news and react emotionally rather than engaging in thoughtful political participation. Can Arendt help us understand today's challenges? Migration crises. Arendt was herself a refugee and wrote about the condition of stateless people and human rights beyond national borders, issues that remain central in global politics today. The rise of authoritarianism. Arendt showed how democratic societies could slowly drift toward authoritarian rule. The growing number of authoritarian governments today proves how relevant her analysis still is. Technology and surveillance. Although Arendt never wrote about the digital world, her ideas about the manipulation of public perception and control of information can be highly useful in analyzing contemporary society. Example: the rise of surveillance states that use digital data to control citizens mirrors some of Arendt's concerns about power and the erosion of individual freedoms. Number 4. Why should we still read Arendt today? To understand the dangers of losing civil liberties. To learn the importance of independent thinking and questioning authority. To recognize how oppressive political strategies have been repeated throughout history. Final thought: Hannah Arendt was not just a philosopher of her time. Her ideas continue to help us understand the modern world. She teaches us that freedom is meaningless without political engagement, and that evil can appear in the most ordinary aspects of daily life. What do you think? Can Arendt's ideas still help us navigate modern politics and society? If you found this discussion insightful, share it with others.